Where's that gust of wind other than what I'm feeling from these fans, right? Like, why are we not experiencing this? Well, here's what I want for us to know as we go through this passage together, all right? We are not trying to teach their experiences. We're trying to experience the teaching. So what I mean by that is that we're not saying that we will experience things exactly the way someone else experienced it in another setting, but we do believe that there is a teaching that we are desiring to experience, and there's truth in here that we're desiring to experience, right? So just to give you a little background of what's happening, in addition to the disciples who had been following Jesus for a long time, waiting for him in Jerusalem, this was the Feast of Pentecost, all right? So if you're familiar at all with it, it's basically a very important feast on the Jewish calendar. It takes place 50 days, Penta, right? It takes place 50 days, like a pentagon, after Passover. And it was an occasion that brought people from all over the region together. They'd all kind of, ascend into Jerusalem. The people that could afford to make that trek. So you get a lot of like religious leaders. You get a lot of like the wealthier folks that are able to make that journey into Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost. That's meaningful, because what it means is that it was the influencers of the Judeo-Christian system that was just kind of forming at the time. They were all coming in to Jerusalem for this feast. All right? So, a sound from heaven like the roaring of a mighty windstorm, and it filled the house where they were sitting. So what's the question we're going to ask? What does this mean, right? We're going to keep asking it. What does this mean? So it's worth noting that what it says happened here is that a sound from heaven like a roaring of a mighty windstorm filled the house where they were sitting, okay? Like a roaring of a mighty windstorm, okay? Sometimes it is helpful when I'm reading to try to imagine what it was that was happening. But I think there's something important here that we need to understand, that maybe we don't know exactly physically what was happening, whether people's like clothes were blowing around because there was like physically a wind. At a minimum, it says like a wind, which means what we can draw, the experience, the teaching that we can experience is this. They were experiencing something that was outside of themselves. And that matters. It's an incredibly important part of this, right? So who was here in New York or in the Northeast for Sandy? Just about everybody, right? Okay, how many of you guys had the guts or the curiosity or the insanity or whatever it was that like when the wind was like really blowing and it was getting pretty bad, you just like kind of wanted to go outside and see what it was like? Yeah, that was totally me, right? So I'm outside in front of my house, I'm like, do your worst. I don't know why, all right? But it was windy, but I just wanted to like see what that was like. Like, what does it feel like to have this kind of like crazy wind blowing at you, right? Or maybe you've been like in like a really bad thunderstorm, or you know, if you've lived in the Midwest, there's lots of tornadoes and you get like all this crazy wind. And when you're in those environments, so for instance, when I was standing out there in the wind, I was palpably aware of the fact that there is this force coming at me that is outside of myself. Something that I can't control, something that I can't manage, something that I needed to show respect to in a way, right? And that's what it is that's happening here. When you find yourself in those situations, so it could be like standing outside in a hurricane like a crazy person, or it could be like maybe standing at the edge of like the Grand Canyon or a mountain or whatever it might be. What are some of the things that we might feel when we're in that environment, when we're confronted by something that we can't control? What comes to mind? It's a real question. What are some things that we feel when we're in that situation?
Fear.
Fear. Fear is a good one.
Awe.
Awe. Very good one.
Adrenaline rush.
Adrenaline rush. Totally. Totally. There's this heightened awareness that there's something outside of ourselves, a force outside of ourselves that's in play there. That's what's happening here, okay? What they were experiencing was something that they had no control over, that was outside of themselves, that came over them. And it filled a house. right? So was it a literal gust of wind? Well, maybe it was. I don't know. I wasn't there. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But the thing that we definitely know from it is that there's something from outside of themselves that fill that room. And right there, the reason why I'm making such a big deal about that is because right there is where we bump into something that is very countercultural for you and for me. Think about it. So there's an increasing sense that our problems come from outside of ourselves, and then inside of us is the power to solve those problems. Okay? So statistically, a lot fewer people go to like psychotherapy now. And part of the reason for that is because a couple of generations ago, there was a perspective that like I would go to therapy so that I could start to work on myself and improve myself, and that will help kind of solve my problems, right? Whereas now, what's more culturally prevalent now is this idea that, yes, I got a problem, but the problem's not me. Who is it? It's you, right? That the problem is outside of myself. And we look at social problems in the world, like racism and socioeconomic problems, right? Or whatever it might be, and the problem is out there, and then you and me, we have the power to go and work and solve those problems. Because the problem's not in here, the problem is out there. Right? And there's this growing sense, and listen, there is a good message out there for you and for me that says you have value and that you are good and that we should grow in a healthy esteem for ourselves, self-esteem. That is good, right? But the sense that you have the power to overcome all the problems that are out there is a lie. It is. And while our culture will say that the problem is out there and the power is in you. You know, Martin Luther rephrased something that Augustine first said, which is that human nature is incurvatus in se. It's Latin. It basically means human nature is curved in on itself. It means that our natural default position is to look wholly at ourselves. So while the culture is saying the problem is out there and the power is in you, the gospel is saying the power is in you. The problem is with you, and the power comes from somewhere else. And in many ways, that is a very important and freeing concept, because the sense that the power is in me, it sounds good. Listen, I love a good song by Pink or something that just tells me how great I am and that I have the power to overcome my problems. I love those songs, all right? I feel great when I'm done listening to those. But I will say that the sense that the power is in me, though it sounds good and I feel good for the moment, it has generally left me feeling disappointed and full of shame and like a bit of a failure. Because though I try, and sometimes it lasts for a little while, it's never really sustainable if I'm trying to muster up the power within me. And part of the good news of the gospel, and part of what is being communicated here when the Holy Spirit came for the first time upon the church, part of what they were experiencing with this gust of wind was the reality that, yes, you might think that the power to solve the problems are in you, but in fact there is a power outside of yourself that is available to you. And that's part of what they were experiencing with this gust of wind, whether it was a literal gust of wind or not. Part of what they were coming to experience together was that the Holy Spirit, a person outside of themselves, was coming into their lives, into the church, into their person. And when the Spirit came upon them in Acts 2, they gathered around something outside of themselves. Right? Look at what else it says. Then, this is verse 3. It says, then what looked like flames or tongues of fire appeared and settled on each of them. And everyone present was filled with the Holy Spirit and began speaking in other languages as the Holy Spirit gave them this ability. Okay, you guys picturing that? Like, objectively weird again, right? Just thinking about what? Like these, how do they frame it? Like flames or tongues of fire coming and landing on everybody. Well, okay, again, do we know exactly what it looked like? None of us were there. But there is something incredibly important that's being communicated here. Because in the Old Testament, the power and the presence of God would often come in the form of fire. That's meaningful. That, like, there's a passage in Ezekiel where he had this vision of God and there was like fire everywhere, right? When God was leading his people from Egypt, from slavery to the promised land, he was leading them by this pillar of fire by night. It was bright, it was warm, it would go before them and protect them from any danger, but they couldn't get too close to it, right? Moses, when God first calls him to go and deliver these people from Egypt, he meets with him in what? A burning bush, right? So many times in the Old Testament, the presence and power of God comes in the form of fire, right? And time and time again, that presence is overwhelming and sometimes fatal to the person who gets in front of its presence, right? They couldn't bear to be there. You ever see, so I'm old school, man. Like, you guys have seen the Ten Commandments, like the movie, like the old school one. I'm not talking like Prince of Egypt or like, you know, whatever, the one with Russell Crowe or whatever. I'm talking about like legit Charlton Heston, like on Easter. We'd start watching it at 7 o'clock. We'd be up till like midnight waiting for the Red Sea to part. Like, it was like a whole thing, all right? But you ever see like when he goes before the burning bush and then when he's done like talking to God or whatever, he comes down, he's like young when he goes up there, but when he comes down, like he's all gray and he's, right? Because like he's overwhelmed by being in the presence of God. I love that movie, by the way. I quote it all the time. If you hear me say, "So let it be written," I say that all the time because it's because of that movie. But right? Yeah, it was Yul Brynner. It's true. Pharaoh. Nice. So, but we digress. All right, so let's see what's happening here. The power and the presence of God is coming upon these followers of Jesus and on you and on me. That is incredible. Think about this for a second. That's why this imagery of this fire is so meaningful. It's saying that the same way that this fire that represents the presence and the power of God was too overwhelming for people, that it was fatal to get too close to it. It would cause a young Moses to come back with his gray hair, right? Because it was so powerful and so overwhelming that power and presence of God was coming and landing on the followers of Jesus that day. That is powerful, powerful imagery. So we read it, and we're like, oh man, it's weird. Like, I don't get it. What was it? Fire, tongues of fire? Whatever it might have looked like. I said, none of us were there. But something incredible happened that day, where the power and the presence of God that was once fatal to humanity comes and lands on and lives in humanity. You know, Tim Keller said it like this. He says, we'll put it up there, he said that when that happened that day, when those flames of fire, those tongues of fire came and landed on people, that every believer is a burning bush, filled with the presence of God. And what that means is that the power and the presence of God is in you and is in me. And it's easy to read Acts chapter 2 and just be like, oh yeah, it's some kind of like cool, weird, like supernatural, freaky thing that happened to a bunch of people back then. But it's not. It's so much more than that. It's in fact the power and the presence of God coming upon people, you and me, and upon his church. So what does this mean? What does this mean? Let's go back to that question. It is getting a little cold in here, right? He's putting his jacket on. I hear that. So what does this mean? That this power comes from outside of ourselves. Well, for one thing, it shifts our perspective, right? It helps us know what is true, that God is God and we are not, that this illusion that we are the ones who can control our destiny, that the problems are out there and the power is in you, it flips that script and it gives us the freedom to know that the problem, yes, the problem is in you and the problem is in me, but there is a force, a power, a person outside of ourselves that comes and brings healing and brings wholeness and brings solution to that problem. And that is incredibly, incredibly freeing when we think about it. Not for nothing, like, even in the smallest ways, I feel relieved when I know something is no longer my responsibility, right? Like, just if I'm normally tasked with something and then someone else takes it on and they say, oh, I'll take care of that, and then I'm like, okay, your problem now. And that's like the greatest feeling in the world, knowing that, like, that's not my problem anymore, right? And that's, listen, it's very freeing. It's like a terrible example, but it's very freeing. It's very freeing to know that the power is not in you. That in fact, the power of God in you, landing upon you, working in you and through you, is part of the work of the Holy Spirit. And that's what began supernaturally on the day of Pentecost. So they gathered around this power that came outside of themselves, and they gather around oneness. Let's take a look at verse 5. Verse 5 says this, "At that time, there were devout Jews from every nation living in Jerusalem. And when they heard the loud noise, everyone came running, and they were bewildered to hear their own languages being spoken by the believers. They were completely amazed. 'How can this be?' they exclaimed. 'These people are all from Galilee, and yet we hear them speaking in our own native languages. Here we are,'" and he lists all these different types of people. And he's talking about how they hear each other in the languages that they understand. Okay, if that happened, which I believe it did, that is again objectively weird, am I right? Like, has that ever happened to any of you guys? Have you ever like heard someone speaking in another language and you know they're speaking another language, but you hear it and it's never happened, right? There's a little bit of a backstory here that's quickly worth going over, all right? A backstory that kind of started like a couple of thousand years before this, all right? So in Genesis chapter 11, all right, you can just listen. We'll go over this in just a couple of quick minutes. In Genesis chapter 11, we see this Mesopotamian society, civilization, where people, not unlike you or me, decided that control was something to be grasped, okay? So they'd experienced some of God's favor, some of God's deliverance, something outside of themselves. Things were going well. They were thriving as a community, and they began to feel that they could kind of like control their good fortune and control the future of what that looks like, including control their relationship with God, as if they were the ones who could control it. So sure enough, they start to build a tower, right? Tower of Babel. Right? And they're building it and they're thinking, if we build this thing, then we can get close enough to God and we can control how we communicate with God and how he interacts with us, right? And God lovingly sees that they're kind of in this illusion of